then you will have no treaty, no vaccine, and no Lieutenant Yar! Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Code of Honor, which is episode 3 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover the episode Code of Honor. So Code of Honor is the episode where the Enterprise travels to another planet far off in the distant galaxy, where they travel to planet Africa, apparently, where it's a lot of black people who have African accents, and they have this strange culture of honor, and they abduct Lieutenant Yar, and they have this precious vaccine that the Enterprise needs, so Picard has to kneel down and do this guy's every wishing and try to thank him for abducting one of his crew members. But at the end of the day, he eventually tricks him so that he loses all his power, and they still get the vaccine, and they get Lieutenant Yar back. So, this episode is very infamous. Now, I just was reading an article about this episode, and they said, ask any Star Trek fan what the worst episode of Star Trek The Next Generation is, and they will say Code of Honor, which I personally don't quite agree with that statement, because I believe most Star Trek fans would actually say Sub Rosa. In fact, I have a friend who I suggested watch Star Trek, and he was kind of into the no bad is good, so he actually looked up what the worst episode of Star Trek Next Generation was, and he actually found it Sub Rosa. So he actually watched Sub Rosa to see how terrible it would be. He thought it wasn't quite as bad, so I guess that speaks well to Star Trek. But in the end, on IMDb, Shades of Grey is the lowest rated episode of Next Generation. Sub Rosa is number 2, and Code of Honor is number 3. But I am kind of splitting hairs here, because Code of Honor is definitely considered one of the worst episodes of Star Trek Next Generation. Now, it didn't quite make my top 10 worst of Next Generation, but oh, maybe it did. No, it definitely did. But it didn't make my top 10 worst of the entire Star Trek franchise, I should say. It was lingering. It made my short list for the top 10 worst of the franchise, but it didn't quite make the cut. But it would definitely be in the teens for me. And I would call it the third most problematic episode of the Star Trek franchise. The first being Prophet and Lace from Deep Space Nine, which coincidentally is also my number 1 worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise. And the second would be Turnabout Intruder, the most sexist episode of the Star Trek franchise, which I just covered recently, well, at least in the revisited. And like the top 10 worst video that I did for the original series. But number 3 would definitely be this episode, which is infamous for being the most racist episode of the Star Trek franchise. In fact, pretty much all of the cast of The Next Generation has spoken up against this episode. I was watching a podcast, the Shuttle podcast with Connor Trenier and other dude, Dominic Keaton, I think, Keating, or the dude who plays Reed. Anyway, I was watching that podcast, and they had Michael Dorn on it, and I think they also brought this up when Denise Crosby was on, because Michael Dorn referred to it as he could not believe they were making this episode. And it was one of only 2 episodes of TNG that Michael Dorn did not appear in. And he said he dodged a bullet, and he was very happy that he did not appear in this episode. And he could not believe when they were making it that they were actually doing it. and Denise Crosby, who was front and center in this episode because this is unfortunately, one of the few episodes of Next Generation that actually focuses on Lieutenant Yar. And she is also not very fond of this episode. And they, in fact, told a story about how they did this Star Trek cruise where the actors they have go on this cruise with fans, can go spend time, they do conventions, and apparently on one of the cruises, Michael Dorn and Denise Crosby did a presentation where they had a viewing of Code and Honor, and they would stop the episode to pause it to just make commentary on just how terrible this episode was. And I would have loved to have seen that, to be honest. I'm a bit disappointed that nobody filmed that and put it online, or it would have been nice to be on this cruise, but alas, I don't really have the money to go on these cruises. But yeah, that would have been so great to see. Jonathan Frakes has also been very vocal about how terrible this episode is. He is quoted as stating that this episode is a, quote, racist piece of shit, and he has also been quoted as saying that he strongly believes that all the streaming services that air Star Trek Next Generation should remove this episode from the rotation, stating that it's what Gene Roddenberry would have wanted. Now, I disagree with that. As much as I hate this episode and as problematic as it is, I don't think any episode should be removed from the rotation, just from a historical perspective. Now, he also said, well, perhaps they should put a disclaimer at the start of the episode saying that, this is made in a different time and some viewers might be offended, so there should, a warning, and that I'd be okay with. Totally, I think this episode definitely deserves it way more than Rejoined, the episode which featured two females kissing, which actually did see a disclaimer, particularly in some southern states when it was first aired, but that's because, biggest, excuse me, something in my throat there. Anyway, so, and this should receive a warning, for being anti-bigotry, so it's the exact opposite reason. But anyway, so, and we also had Will Wheaton, who said that if the cast wasn't arbitrarily decided to be African American, the idea of this episode being racist or non-racist wouldn't have been an issue. Something I agree with. LeVar Burton was also very vocal that this episode was terrible. Brent Spiner referred to this episode as the worst episode we ever did. And who else? Garrett Wong from Voyager said that he stopped watching Next Generation when he saw this episode and saw how terrible it was. And he said it was actually probably a good thing that watching this episode would lend him the part on Voyager, because he didn't consider himself a Star Trek fan. He felt that if he actually went through and watched all the good episodes of Next Generation, he would have been too nervous during his auditions, which is funny. Now, believe it or not, this episode actually has its defenders. Pretty much every episode does. But defenders in particular are David A. Goodman, who is a consulting producer on the Next Generation, of Enterprise, who is a consulting producer on Enterprise, and Gene Roddenberry's son, Rod Roddenberry, defend this episode, saying that as weirdly offensive as people think Code of Honor is, I at least liked it because it was something new and different. This is from Goodman. There was some, and then Rod Roddenberry mentioned there was some action and had a great score, probably the best score of any Next Generation episode. I'm going to have to very strongly disagree with Mr. Rod Roddenberry there on that one, because as I was watching this episode, had the exact opposite thought. That despite how, taking away, not even addressing how racist or problematic this episode was, I still wouldn't have liked this episode because I thought the score was terrible. Now, getting into the score, which is an interesting thing to talk about because this was probably, I believe, the only episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that was scored by a composer who actually did music for the original series. Fred Steiner, who did the score for a lot of episodes, quite a few episodes of the original series, including Balance of Terror, Mirror Mirror, and the Tholian Web, amongst many others. Here's the thing. The original series music is okay in the original series, and even then I'm a bit iffy on it, and it's still silly, but it's in the 60s, so you forgive it. By the time we get to the late 80s, we should not be having these silly, cheesy 60s soundtrack. And that's what it does. It sounds so cheesy, so ridiculous, so like 60s like. In fact, I've heard other reviewers critique this episode saying it felt like a throwback to the original series, that felt more like an original series episode than a Next Generation episode. And I think the music does make it feel very 60s-ish and very out of date and very cheesy-ish. Now, this is something I'll talk about with the Next Generation overall for season 1, was that it felt like a syndicated show. Like, I felt like later seasons of Next Generation and pretty much all of Deep Space Nine, which were both syndicated shows in the late 80s, early 90s, and mid 90s respectively, didn't feel like syndicated shows, because most syndicated shows, and then again, people who weren't really, maybe not old enough, who weren't watching syndicated shows in the 90s and 80s, wouldn't realize how bad and cheesy these shows were. In fact, I remember a lot of people, like, this is one thing, someone made a YouTube video about Game of Thrones if it was made in the 90s, and they did a theme song that was supposed to be 90s styles, but it was absolutely 80s style. And when people were rightfully arguing back against this, saying, well, this wasn't 80s style, 90s style is 80s style, they were like, well, this is just like the Highlander show, which was a syndicated show that came out in the mid-90s. And like, yeah, that did come out in the mid-90s, but it was still 80s style, because these syndicated shows were terrible. I'm sorry, B5 fans, but first 2 seasons of B5 also fall into this category, which is hard for me to watch. I think they're almost even worse, not in terms of story, but in terms of cheesy syndication, cheesy 90s, 80s cheesiness. But even B5 would be a high example of syndicated shows, because most of these syndicated shows, and I think Baywatch might have started as syndication as well, were just so cheesy and so bad and so like Xena and Hercules are good examples of this, but there were some that are even worse than that. And so as the first 2 seasons of TNG are the only seasons of these syndicated Star Trek shows that actually feel syndicated, and I think this episode, to me, is the episode that feels the most syndicated. There's most cheesiness and out of date and silly and stupid and just bad. And I'm talking about even disregarding all the racist elements, it would still be a terrible episode for those reasons. Now, speaking of which, so this episode, as originally written, was supposed to be a reptilian-like aliens that they were visiting, that were supposed to be modeled off of Japanese culture. And you do have a little bit of that still in the script when Picard gives them this ancient token of, I believe it was Japanese, and they've said, oh, it's a culture very similar to yours. But in the episode as presented, obviously the culture is more reminiscent of African cultures. Gee, I wonder why. Than it is Japanese. And plus, having it as reptilian aliens, well, it's like it wouldn't have been racist then. It would have made more sense, and I think it actually would have went a long way to making this episode not be as freaking terrible as it was. Now, I'm just trying to bring up the gentleman's name. So this episode was originally directed by Russ Mayberry, who had directed a lot of 60s, 70s TV shows like The Brady Bunch, and there was like, hold on, I'm going to bring up some of these other shows that he directed. The Brady Bunch, The Ironside, Kojak, The Equalizer, Heat of the Night, $6 Million Man, stuff like that. And so he was brought on to direct this episode, and it was the only episode of Star Trek that he ever directed, because he was fired from this episode, and he was actually seen as directly responsible for casting African Americans, solely African Americans, to play this part, which it was not originally in the script. It was not originally in the production plan. It was apparently they were going to cast African Americans to play the guards, like Luton's guards, but this director single-handedly decided to cast the entire plan of aliens as African Americans, and had them put on African accents and had a costume in a way that would be reminiscent or signify or remind at least those in Western culture of Africa. So and so that is where the problem lies. Now, I've heard accusations that Mr. Mayberry was racist himself, which of course would make a lot of sense. But again, this is just hearsay accusations, so I'm not going to make anything firm or anything like that. But of what is on the record is that Roddenberry fired him and hired the first AD, Les Landru, to take over. And this Les would go on to direct many episodes of The Next Generation, and he went on to become a regular director. But firing a director and putting the first AD, that's a very different job, being a first AD to actually being a director. And the fact that they did that it's quite amazing. And Roddenberry apparently was extremely unhappy with how Russ Mayberry handled this episode, and that's why he was never allowed back on Star Trek ever again. But they said that Les Landru couldn't really salvage the episode by then because the whole thing had been cast, so it was too late to to make it not be racist. It was too late for that, and most of it was filmed, so there was only so much that he could do, and really that's not much. And again, this is probably why Jonathan Frakes brought up that Roddenberry would want this erased from the record, because he was totally not happy with how this episode turned out, and fair enough. But also talking about the creative team of this episode, sorry if I could bring up the, let's see if I can, but yes, this episode was written by Catherine Powers, and as I said, the original script of this episode was supposed to be reptilians or whatever, so it wasn't, the racist element wasn't in the script itself, but there's still elements of weird way that they handled women. Let me put it that way, with how women were treated as property or whatever, or they owned the property and the men controlled everything, and they were using Lieutenant Yard, kidnapped her, and was using her in the ploy to gain power. And in fact, Catherine Powers wrote the episode, which I believe was also, this is the third episode for Next Generation. She wrote the second episode for Stargate SG-1 that saw the, SG-1 travel to another planet where there was a group of mongrels who captured commander, or was it lieutenant? I think it was lieutenant or captain. It was captain or major. Maybe at this point I'm getting these ranks mixed up. It was Major Carter. They captured her and sort of made her fight for some power struggle as well. And I remember when I watched, and the episode's called Emancipation, which I did have on my top 5 worst episodes of Stargate SG-1 when I did that video. And then when I watched that episode, I remember being like struck with how similar it was to Code of Honor. It was like, oh my god, this episode reminds me so much of Code of Honor, and it's so terrible. And then, of course, I found out later on, years later, it was because it was written by the same person, which is mind-blowing to me, that they would go write this, and granted, Emancipation, as terrible as that episode is not quite as bad as Code of Honor, because, as I said, the director made it worse. Jesus Christ. So anyway, I never, like, when I first saw this episode when I was like 12 years old, when I first started watching Next Generation, I wasn't like as consciously aware of just how racist it was or how problematic it was, but I even back then did not like it. Like, I thought it was ridiculous. It's cheesy. As I said, the cheesy soundtrack, the cheesy dialogue, the story about them kidnapping Yar and threatening, and the fact that freaking Picard had to grovel and be like, oh, please give us this vaccine. Oh, thank you very much for abducting one of my crew members. Can I grovel some more so you'll give me the vaccine? Like, I just hate that. It's just, and now you could argue that at the end of the episode, Picard gets the better of him, but it's the whole, like, fight to the death thing is so dumb. I can't believe Rod Roddenberry said the music was great. The music is just so bad. And apparently, something else Denise Crosby brought up about this episode, that in the fight scene, that little tower that the two competitors were fighting on was made out of glass. I mean, in real life, like in the production. And it wasn't safe, and if someone slipped, the glass broke, and a shard of glass went into her eye, and she had to go to the hospital. I mean, this just sounds like an awful, terrible production in so many ways. And yeah, so even when I was 12 years old, I hated this episode. I found it cheesy, and yeah, it just didn't really work. And of course, as I got older, I started to understand just how problematic it is to have an alien race in the far off distance of the galaxy all happen to be Africans. Essentially, it's putting them as the other, as these strange aliens that are just Africans. Like, that's and this is something I talked about before, and this gets more in Will Wheaton's quote about how, or was it Will Wheaton or someone else? I believe it was Will Wheaton who said that he believes that the racism and how problematic this episode is was not necessarily intentional. And that's something, well, at least as far as the writer goes against the director, that's another story. But I believe that's true. That they didn't necessarily, because it was going off of, they were just emulating a lot of, classical works like Tarzan and whatnot from, earlier literature and whatnot, where, places like Africa, India, and the Middle East are seen as exotic and weird and different because they, to be fair, from a European perspective, they were in these earlier centuries. But from a modern perspective, and especially from a fucking future perspective, they're not weird or exotic. The Federation is made up of different freaking aliens from all over the galaxy. A place that is on Earth is not in the least fucking bit exotic, and yet they're portraying this alien culture as just like And so, yeah. And so they're emulating something that's outdated and could possibly be forgiven or possibly even work in the perspective of being written in earlier centuries and being about an earlier centuries perspective. But in the future, does not, so very doesn't work. It makes it racist, which it is. And so, yes, it is a very difficult episode to watch. And then you have like stuff in the episode where like Wesley Crusher is sitting on the, like, Riker just has him hang out on the bridge for no good reason. Why don't you sit at the con? Well, why doesn't any of the other kids? Why don't you just open it up as a playground, let any kids sit at the con? Well, but to be fair, of course, Wesley already saved the ship and naked now, but not going to get into that. And we have the silly scene with Geordi shaving, and Data tries to tell a joke, and Geordi's like, "Oh no, you don't!" And Data kind of corners them, and says gives a terrible delivery about kittlings or whatever, and then he accidentally says, "including the kittlings," and Geordi starts laughing hysterically. And it's like, "Oh, that's funny." He's like, and he's really laughing. I'm like, it's not really that funny. He just said kittlings instead of kidneys, so it's not really that funny. But it's kind of an early example of the friendship that these two have, so I guess that's sort of a bright spot. I mean, even if it was handled quite terribly here. And yeah, the dialogue is just so cringy with Yar, but as I said, at least she gets an episode. Like, at least it spotlights her. And yeah, it's just so cheesy. Like at the end of the first act, after they meet Yar and they show Lutan talking to his first, first officer or first mate or whatever you want to call him, his vice president. I don't know, whatever you want to call that dude, henchman. When he's talking to him, he's like, "Yes, Lieutenant Yar will work quite well for our plans." Just so cheesy. And then during the fight where you had that first mate guy or whatever, when Lutan's wife looked like she was gonna die or whatever, she was like, "Careful!" And it was so obvious they were setting up for him to be the one that she actually loved, and so that she would actually ends up giving him the power, and he becomes the new leader of the planet or whatever. It's like, you know what? When I forget what this episode is and I hear the term Code of Honor, I immediately think, like, for a second before my, consciousness, comes in, I realize what's going on, I just instinctively think, oh, this is a Klingon episode, right? Like, Matter of Honor or something like that, because that would make more sense. But I was like, oh, no. It's not dealing with a code of honor as far as Klingons go, which would make way more sense. It's dealing with honor as far as, racism. And it's just like, such a blight on the next generation. And even though I didn't have this in my top 10 worst of the franchise, and it's not in my... I can't remember where I placed it in the worst of TNG. I think this was number 3 or 4, so it's not even my number 1 or 2. So I still hate this episode, though, even though I didn't. And as I said, like, as problematic as it is, I think there are 2 that are slightly more problematic, but that doesn't really, make this episode better or anything. It's just, really, really, really bad. And I think I've sort of mentioned that enough. Just, I can't really harp on just how terrible this episode is. The cheesy music, I keep thinking about the cheesy music and the cheesy dialogue and the cheesy costuming, and Sorry, it's just bad. So anyway, let me thank my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. It really helps the channel. We have Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joel Viles, Alessandro Michelosio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. It really helps the channel continue, helps the channel thrive. Yes, thank you so much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Ricky that says, "Oh my god, here we go, another shit episode. I know this is infamously one of the worst episodes of the show, and I totally agree, but I think this is the second worst of the season. First of all, this episode is so obviously racist, the way that they portray the alien culture here, and to be fair, it wasn't intentionally to be racist. It just happened to be the final product of the episode. I also think that the Tasha Yar story where she has to fight with the wife of the leader was so dumb and uninteresting. I mean, really, this leader is acting so irrational, and I dare say contrived as well. Once again, a terrible, horrible episode, and once again, my rating is a 1 out of 10. So, next comment is from Norman Buckwald. And Norman Buckwald says, "I still can't believe this happened in 1987. 1972, maybe. What is worse is this is really the only episode truly featured with Tasha Yar. No wonder Denise Crosby chose to bail." And final comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, "Code of Honor, or as I prefer to call it, Fear of a Black Planet. This episode stinks. The Legionnaires, or however you pronounce her name, are written as 1940s tribal African stereotypes and dressed like something out of Aladdin. Yar and Yarina? Come on. Every time Lutan speaks, I expect him to start singing the Banana Boat song because he's putting on the same accent. The woman who wrote this turkey also penned the SG-1 episode Emancipation, which has a very similar plot. FYI, a vaccine is not an antidote. 1 perfect shave out of 10. And you have no vaccine and no Lieutenant Yars." I do love quoting that as much as I hate this episode. Anyway, my rating for Code of Honor out of 10 is, of course and obviously, a 1, the worst. A cheesy episode, cheesy dialogue, cheesy special effects, cheesy costuming, cheesy music, cheesy storyline, and oh yeah, let's throw in a bit of racism just for good measure. And that's the thing. Like, I talked about episodes like Spock's Brain, where if you remove the silly brains element of the plot, it would actually be a halfway decent episode. Whereas this episode, if you remove the racism and say they were all just lizards or whatever, and there was no sort of African commentary here, then even if they say they weren't like African coded the way that, you know, those Trade Federation aliens from Star Wars Phantom Menace are like Asian coded, which makes them a bit problematic. But let's say they didn't even do that and they're truly alien, like reptilian lizard thingies. That would only improve this episode slightly. It would maybe take it out of the top 10 worst, but keep it in the top 20 worst, because it's still cheesy, it's still dumb, it still has the problematic in terms of the way they treat, you know, women as possessions, and how Yar kind of had the hots for the Luton guy, and yeah, it's just bad. It's just bad, everything about it. So that is it for my review of Code of Honor. So thanks so much for watching this video, and I shall be back very shortly with more Star Trek reviews. This Thursday, of course, we'll be reviewing the latest episode of Strange New Worlds, and then this Monday coming up, I will be reviewing Next Generation episode The Last Outpost. Not quite as bad as this episode, but still not a winner. And then Thursday I'll cover the latest episode of Strange New Worlds, and then after that I'll be back here Saturday to cover Where No One Has Gone Before, the first halfway decent episode of Next Generation I get to cover. So be sure to subscribe to keep up with all of that as I continue to review Star Trek and many other shows as well. And thanks a lot for watching.